She was never anything more than a convenient set of ears, Alaric. You do understand that. Everything she ever told me, she told me because I asked her to. The words came through the half-open door of the war room, like smoke under a threshold, and Wren Thornvale felt the bond in her chest snap the way green wood snaps in a fire, sudden and wet and final. She had crossed the entire east wing of the citadel to bring the Alpha King a tincture for the headaches he refused to admit he had, and she had stopped there, one hand raised to knock, when she heard her own name spoken by the person she trusted more than her own breath. Her best friend, Calla Vane, who had braided moon lilies into Wren's hair the night before the mating rites, who had held her hand through the fevers of her first change, who had whispered promises in the dark that they would always be sisters, no matter what the Pax decided. That Calla, the one who now stood on the other side of the door, telling the King of Ironmoon that she had spent 3 years harvesting Wren's secrets, like a farmer stripping a field. The tincture bottle went cold in Wren's palm. The blood drained from her face so fast she heard it, a rushing behind her ears, and her knees remembered they were only knees. She did not scream. Some ancient, careful part of her, the part that had survived the burning of Ashenmoor when she was 6 years old, the part that had learned to make herself small and quiet and useful, put a hand over her own mouth before her mouth could betray her. And through the gap in the door, she watched the man she had bound her life to lean back in his great chair of black antler and iron, and she watched him smile, the smile she had once believed belonged only to her, and she heard him say, "Then she has served her purpose. Draw up the annulment. Coldwind's daughter arrives at the new moon, and I won't have a hedge witch cluttering the dais." A hedge witch. 3 years of marriage, 3 years of her hands on his wounds, and her voice in his counsel, and her body against the cold of him at night, and she had become a hedge witch cluttering the dais. Wren stood very still in the corridor, while the 2 people who had ruined her carved up what was left of her future, and somewhere in the marrow of her, quietly, a door that had been open her whole life swung shut. She lowered her hand from her mouth. She looked at the tincture, this small, useless mercy she had made for a man who deserved his headaches, and she made herself a promise so cold and so complete that it felt less like a decision than a homecoming. You will not have to draw up the annulment, she thought, because by the new moon there will be nothing here to annul. She set the little bottle down on the floor, precisely in the exact center of the corridor, where he would have to step over it or crush it, and she walked away without a sound, and the citadel that had never truly been her home did not so much as sigh at her leaving. That night, she did not weep. Weeping was for people who still expected the world to be kind, and Wren had unlearned that expectation at 6 with the taste of ash on her tongue. Instead, she sat on the floor of her chamber in the tower they had given her, the one with the beautiful view, and the door that locked only from the outside, and she counted. She counted the things that were truly hers, and the things that only looked like hers. The gowns were his, the jewels were his, the rooms were his. The title, Consort of Ironmoon, was his to give, and, apparently, his to revoke over a cup of wine. But the small canvas satchel beneath the loose stone in the hearth was hers, because she had packed it 2 years ago. On the first night she had felt the temperature of Alaric's regard begin to drop. On the first night, some part of her had known this ending was coming, even while the rest of her had begged to be wrong. In it were the things a woman keeps when she has learned that safety is a story other people tell you to keep you still, a folded map oiled against the weather, a pouch of coin she had earned quietly selling remedies to the citadel's servants, never once touching the king's allowance, a knife her father had made, and a scroll, brittle at the edges, that she had stolen back from the citadel archive one careful page at a time, because it was the only thing in the world that was truly, wholly, indisputably hers, and no one living but Wren Thornvale even remembered what it was. She unrolled it now in the low light, the Ashenmoor Charter, sealed in silver wax by a council of Pax 3 generations dead, granting the silver-blooded line of Ashenmoor dominion over the northern reaches, the deep mines, and the headwaters of the Vale, the river that fed every farm and forge and throat in the Iron Moon dominion. She had been the last silver blood, the orphaned child of a slaughtered house, and everyone had agreed it was a great kindness that the king had taken her in and made her his. Everyone had agreed she should be grateful. She rolled the charter back up and slid it into the satchel, and she did not feel grateful. She felt, for the first time in a very long time, awake. She left 3 hours before dawn, and she did it the way she did everything, carefully. She did not steal a horse from the royal stable, because a stolen royal horse is a rope waiting for a neck. She wore the plain grey wool of a servant, and walked out through the kitchen yard where the ovens were already warming, and the only creature that marked her passage was old Bram, the gatekeeper, who had been minding the sally-port of the citadel since before Alaric's father wore the crown. Bram was the sort of man the powerful never see, which was precisely why he saw everything, and when Wren came to the small iron door with her satchel and her drawn hood, he did not lift his lantern to her face, and he did not raise the alarm. He set down the whetstone he was working, and he looked at her for a long moment with eyes gone milky at the edges, but clear as river ice at the centre. "So it's tonight," he said. Not a question. Wren's throat closed. "You knew." "I know the shape of a body that's decided to live," the old man said. "Seen a few. Not many in this house." He rose, joints crackling, and drew the bolt for her, and the cold night air came in smelling of frost and pine and freedom. She should have gone. Every hour before the household woke was an hour of head start, and she had planned this exit down to the minute. But she stopped in the doorway, because she owed this old man the truth more than she owed anyone in the towers behind her a goodbye. "Calla was reporting to him," she said. "The whole time, everything I ever told her." Bram did not look surprised, and that hurt more than surprise would have. "The vain girl came from Cold Winds Holdings," he said. "Did you never wonder how a border pauper found her way to the future consort's bedchamber as a bosom friend 3 years back, the very season you came of age?" Wren had wondered, once, and then she had let herself be loved instead of letting herself be wise, because she had been lonely, and Calla had been warm, and the trade had felt worth it. "I was a fool," she said. "You were a girl who wanted a sister," Bram said. "That's not foolishness. That's a wound they knew how to use." He pressed something into her hand as she stepped through the door, a small cold weight, and when she looked down, she saw it was a signet, worn smooth, bearing a wolf's head crowned with a crescent. "That's the seal of the old Ashenmoor wardens," he said. "Your grandfather gave it to my father to keep the night your house burned, in case a silver blood ever needed to prove she was one. I've carried it 40 years, waiting for someone to come who'd earned the right to it. Go north, girl. Go to the mines. There are folk up there who never bent the knee to Iron Moon, who remember Ashenmoor, who've been waiting longer than I have. Show them that seal and speak your father's name, and see what the North still owes the Silver Line." Wren closed her fist around the seal and felt the cold of it seep into her blood like a truth. "Why?" she asked him. "Why help me?" Bram smiled, and it was a sad and beautiful thing. "Because 30 years ago, I stood at this same door, and I let a different woman go through it, and she never made it to the tree line, and I've carried that too. Tonight, I'd like to carry something else." And he shut the iron door behind her, softly, and Wren Thornvale walked out of the only life she had ever been permitted into a darkness that was, for the first time, entirely her own. She walked until the citadel was a black tooth against the greying sky, and then she walked until it was nothing at all. She did not look back once. Looking back was for people who had left something behind worth grieving, and everything worth grieving was already in her satchel or already dead. When the sun came up, she was in the low hills, moving through wet fern with the seal cold against her chest and the map warm from her hand, and she felt the strangest thing rise in her, stranger than grief, stranger than rage. She felt light, as though for 3 years she had been carrying a stone in each hand, one called gratitude and one called hope, and she had finally set them both down. She let herself change, then, for the first time in months, out there, where no one could see and no one could report it. The wolf that came out of her was not the small grey shadow she showed the court. It was silver, holy silver, silver as the moon on snow, the coat of the Ashenmoor line that her keepers had spent 3 years teaching her to keep dull and hidden so that no one would remember what she was. She ran north through the wet dawn in a body that finally matched her name, and the world outside remained entirely ignorant of what it had just lost. Behind her, the machinery of her erasure ground on without her, and it is worth staying a moment in the citadel to watch it, because dramatic irony is a kind of justice, and there was no one in that fine, cold place who deserved it more than the 2 who now believed they had won. Calla Vain woke late that morning in her comfortable rooms, the rooms Wren had secured for her, the rooms Wren had furnished from her own quiet earnings when the king's steward had claimed there was no chamber to spare for the consort's companion. Calla stretched in the warm light and felt, for the first time in 3 years, something loosen in her chest that she had not known was clenched. It was done. The message she had carried to the king the night before, the last of 1,000 messages, had been the message that ended her assignment. She could stop now. She could stop lying to the woman who had wept on her shoulder and trusted her with the shape of her fears. And the strange thing, the thing Calla had not planned for, was that stopping did not feel like relief. It felt like a held breath she couldn't release, because there was no one to release it to. She had told herself for 3 years that Wren was a means, a task, a door she had been sent to open. She had told herself that the friendship was a costume. But costumes, worn long enough, grow into the skin, and as Calla dressed that morning, she found herself reaching for the blue thread to braid into her hair, the way Wren had taught her. And her hand stopped, and she stood in the middle of her fine, borrowed room, with the thread in her fingers, and understood, too late, in the way that all the people in this story understood things too late, that she had loved the woman she had spent 3 years betraying. But by then the annulment was being drawn up 2 floors below, and Coldwind's outriders were already on the North Road, escorting the king's true prize, and the machine did not care what Calla's hands had finally understood. In the war room, Alaric Duskbane, King of Iron Moon, was in an excellent humor. He had spent the morning receiving the congratulations of his inner circle on the coming union with the House of Coldwyn, and every congratulation was a coin dropped into the great vault of his certainty. Magnus Coldwin was the richest silver lord in the 7 Packs. His daughter Vesper was said to be the most beautiful woman east of the Vale, and beauty to Alaric was a form of currency, and currency was a form of power, and power was the only language he had ever bothered to learn. Marrying Coldwin's daughter would tie the wealthiest holding in the Dominion to his crown, and answer, once and for all, the whispers that Iron Moon's treasury had been running dry for a decade. He did not think about Wren at all, when his steward mentioned, delicately, that the consort could not be found in her tower that morning. Alaric waved a ringed hand. "Let her sulk in the gardens. She'll come crawling by supper. Where else would she go? The girl has no house, no coin, no pack. I gave her everything she is. She'll remember that." It did not occur to him, this man who had spent his whole life being given things, that a woman who has been given everything can also, in a single clean motion, give it all back. It did not occur to him that the tincture bottle his boot crushed in the east corridor that afternoon, splintering against the cold stone, was the last small kindness he would ever be offered by the only person in that citadel who had ever loved him without a ledger. He walked over it and did not look down. High in the north, at the edge of the deep country, where the pines grew close and black and the old mine-heads stood like the ribs of buried giants, Wren Thornvale came out of the tree line 4 days later, footsore and thinner and burning with a purpose that had cauterized her grief into something usable. She had eaten what the land gave her and slept in the hollows of roots, and somewhere on that long walk she had stopped being the woman who set the tincture down in the corridor and become someone the corridor's owner would not have recognized. She came to a gate of lashed timber, guarding a village that appeared on no royal map, a place of stone huts and smoke and hard-eyed people who kept the old ways, and when the sentries lowered their spears at her and asked her name and her business, she did not say she was a runaway consort begging shelter. She reached into her collar and drew out the worn signet Bram had carried for 40 years, the wolf's head crowned with the crescent, and she held it up so the grey daylight caught the silver of it, and she said, in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, "My name is Wren of Ashenmoor, daughter of Corin the Silver, last of the Warden line, and I have come home." The nearest sentry went very still. He looked at the seal, and then he looked at her, at the eyes, at the bones of her face, and then, slowly, this hard old man of the deep country lowered his spear and lowered himself with it, down to one knee in the frozen mud, and the sentry beside him followed, and the one beside him, until the whole gate had knelt, and Wren stood above them, shaking, not with cold, understanding for the first time that the world had lied to her about what she was worth, and that she was about to spend the rest of her life making it recant. 6 months later, the North was no longer a rumour. It is remarkable what a woman can build when she has been given nothing, and therefore owes nothing to anyone, when every stone she lays is her own, and every alliance she forges with clean hands. The village at the mine-head had a name again, the old name, Ashenmoor, and it was no longer a village. Wren had found in the deep country not the desperate remnant she had expected, but a people who had simply been waiting, for 2 generations, for a reason to stop waiting. They had kept the old furnaces cold and the old shafts flooded, rather than sell their silver cheap to Iron Moon's tax collectors, and they had told themselves stories of the silver line that would one day return, and most of them had stopped believing the stories the way people stop believing in spring in the depth of a hard winter, out of self-protection, not out of truth. And then a silver wolf had walked out of the pines with the warden's seal around her neck and her father's knife at her hip, and she had not asked them to serve her. That was the thing they told each other in wonder in those first months. She had not asked them to kneel and stay kneeling. She had gone down into the flooded mines with the engineers and gotten silt to the waist. She had sat up 3 nights with the fever that took the tanners' children and brought 2 of the 3 back from the edge with hands that knew what they were doing. She had opened the charter her house had held for 3 generations and shown them the truth of it, that Ashenmore was not a beggar at Ironmoon's table, but a sovereign holding in its own right, older than the Duskbane crown, owed tribute and water rights, and a seat in the Council of Pax that no one had claimed in 40 years, because there had been no one left alive to claim it. She had made them not subjects, but citizens, and she had made herself not their queen, but their warden, the first word among equals. And there is a loyalty that money cannot buy and status cannot compel, the loyalty of people who have watched you bleed beside them. And Wren had it now, wholly, in a way Alaric Duskbane had never once possessed the loyalty of anyone. The mines were running again. The great furnace at the head of the valley threw its red light up onto the snow every night, and the first silver in 40 years was coming up out of the deep dark, and Wren had done the thing that her keepers had raised her to never even imagine doing. She had made herself rich, and she had made herself powerful, and she had done it with the very inheritance they had told her was worthless. But it was not the silver that mattered most in the end. It was the water. She had walked the high country in the thaw with an old map and a colder purpose, and she had confirmed with her own eyes what the brittle charter claimed, that the headwaters of the Viale, the river that fed every field and every forge and every mouth in the whole Ironmoon dominion, rose in the northern reaches, on Ashenmore land, on her land, held by the Silver Line under a charter. No one in the south had bothered to read in 2 generations, because they had been too busy congratulating themselves on their strength to remember where their strength came from. Alaric Duskbane sat on his black antler throne in a citadel that could not survive a summer without the Viale, and he did not know that the river was hers. It was in those 6 months, too, that Wren met the man who would become the second great fact of her new life, and it is important to say that she was not looking for him and did not need him, because that is precisely why he mattered. Soren Ravenscar came to Ashenmore in the spring as the emissary of Stormfell, the free pack of the eastern coast, the one holding in all the 7 that had never sworn to Ironmoon, a rough, seafaring people of shipwrights and traders who bent the knee to no king and answered only to the moon and the market. He came to buy silver, and he stayed to be astonished. He was a broad, weathered man, with a laugh that came up from somewhere deep and no patience at all for pretense, and when the warden of Ashenmore met him at the furnace head, with soot on her hands and a ledger under her arm, and named him a price for her silver that was fair and firm and left no room to haggle, he did not do what other men did, which was to be charmed by her looks and condescend to her competence. He looked at the price, and he looked at the woman, and he said, "That's a good price. Who taught you to run a mine?" And Wren said, "Nobody. I read the ledgers of the men who ran it wrong, and I did the opposite." And Soren Ravenscar threw back his head and laughed that deep laugh and said, "By the moon, Warden, I think I'll build my whole trade on your silver, if you'll have a rough eastern dog for a partner." And that was the beginning of the thing between them, which grew slowly over shared ledgers and honest arguments and long walks along the mine roads into something Wren had never once had in 3 years of marriage to a king. She had a partner who respected her before he ever desired her, who wanted her strength intact rather than sanded down, who never once in all the seasons she knew him asked her to be smaller. And if she was slow to trust it, if it took her the better part of a year to let Soren Ravenscar close enough to braid moon lilies into her hair, the way a sister once had, well, that was the price of what Calla had done to her, and Soren paid it patiently, because he understood that a woman who has been betrayed by love doesn't need more love thrown at her. She needs to watch it hold its ground. While Ashenmoor's furnaces climbed toward the sky, the citadel of Iron Moon was learning, slowly and then all at once, the cost of a river it didn't own. The wedding of Alaric Duskbane and Vesper Coldwyn had been the most magnificent event the Dominion had seen in a generation, and everyone who was anyone had come to see the king take his silver bride, and Wren, north in her valley, had heard of it and felt nothing, which surprised her, until she understood that you cannot mourn a home you finally see was a cage. But magnificence is expensive, and Iron Moon's treasury had been running dry long before Wren walked out of the kitchen yard, and the marriage that was meant to fill the vault had, in the way of such marriages, mostly emptied it faster. Magnus Coldwyn had not sent his daughter north out of love for the Duskbane crown. He had sent her the way a chess player advances a queen, and Alaric, who fancied himself a master of the board, had not once considered that he might be a square upon it. Vesper Coldwyn was everything the king had brought her to be. She was beautiful the way a sword is beautiful, all edge and cold light, and she was decorative in the way of a thing that has never had to be anything but decorative, and she had been raised by Magnus to know precisely 2 things, that she was a weapon, and whose hand she was truly in. She sat on the dais where Wren had once sat, and she wore the jewels Wren had never asked for, and she was bored within a month, and cruel within 2, because cruelty is what boredom becomes in a person with power and no purpose. She dismissed the servants who had loved the old consort. She had the healing gardens torn up and paved for a dancing floor. She laughed at the petitions of the border packs and told the king to raise their levies, and Alaric, drunk on the illusion that he had traded up, let her, because it was easier than seeing what he had actually done. And all the while, in the letters that travelled the secret roads between the citadel and the Coldwyn holdings, Vesper reported to her father exactly as another woman had once reported to a king, because the world of this story turns on the same wheel again and again, and the only question is who is at last strong enough to break it. Magnus Coldwyn was playing a longer game than Alaric had the imagination to fear. He did not want to marry into the Iron Moon crown. He wanted to inherit it. He had lent the king's treasury vast sums to pay for the wedding and the levies and the king's endless appetite for magnificence, and every loan was a link in a chain, and Magnus was patient the way only the truly wealthy can afford to be, waiting for the season when Iron Moon would owe him more than it could ever pay, so that he could call the debt and take the crown as forfeit, and put his own blood upon the Black Antler throne. It was a good plan. It had only one flaw, and the flaw was a river, because Magnus Coldwyn, for all his cunning, had made the same mistake as the king he meant to devour. He had looked at the map of the Dominion, and seen fields and forges and mines and mouths, and he had not thought to ask where the water came from, and so neither of the 2 most powerful men in the south knew that the throne they were fighting over drank from a cup held in the soot-stained hand of a woman they had both dismissed. The drought came in the second summer. It came the way droughts come, slowly and then as a catastrophe, and the Vale dropped and dropped until the great mill wheels of the lower dominion stood still in cracked mud, and the harvest withered in the fields, and the forges that made Iron Moon's weapons went cold for want of water to quench the steel. The people grew hungry, and then they grew angry, and a hungry, angry people is the one thing no amount of magnificence can rule. Alaric sent men north to find the source of the failing river, to dredge it, to force it, and his men rode into the deep country and did not come back with the river. They came back white-faced with a story no one in the citadel wanted to hear, that the headwaters had not failed, that the flow was being held, deliberately, behind new stone weirs in the high reaches, by a holding that flew a silver wolf on a black field, a holding that called itself Ashenmoor, ruled by a warden who claimed under an ancient charter the right to every drop of water that fell in the northern reaches, and who would sell that water to the south, she said, at a fair price, in coin, in silver, and in the honouring of certain very old debts. The king raged. He did not understand at first that he was defeated. He was a man who had solved every problem in his life by force, and so he raised a levy of warriors he could barely feed and sent them up the north road to seize the headwaters, and they marched into the narrow passes of the deep country, where the Ashenmoor folk knew every stone, and they found the passes held against them by hard, silent people who fought like they had 2 generations of grievance to settle, which they did, and the king's army came back down the north road, smaller and hungrier than it went up, having learned the ancient lesson that you cannot conquer the top of a mountain from the bottom of it. And still Alaric did not go himself. His pride would not let him ride north to bargain with a rebel warden like a supplicant. So the drought deepened, and the debt to Coldwyn deepened with it, and the chain drew tighter around the king's throat, and Wren of Ashenmoor sat in the north with her hand on the tap of the whole dominion, and waited, because she had learned patience in a cage, and she was not about to squander it now that she was free. It was Vesper who broke first, and it is worth watching how, because the replacement always reveals herself in the same way in the end, by grasping for a power that was never hers to hold. When the granaries of the citadel ran low and the great households began to feel the drought at their own tables, Magnus Coldwyn stopped answering his daughter's letters, and Vesper understood, in a rush of very cold clarity, that her father did not intend to save a sinking crown, that he intended to let it sink and then salvage what floated. She had been raised to be a weapon, and a weapon that has served its purpose is discarded. And Vesper Coldwyn, sitting in the fine, cold rooms that had once been Wren's, discovered that she was about to inherit the exact fate she had helped inflict, and there was a justice in that so precise it might have been designed. She went to Alaric in the night and told him the truth, all of it, that her father held his debts and meant to call them, that the marriage had been a siege engine wheeled inside his own gates, that the throne he thought he had strengthened had been undermined from the first hour of their union. She did not tell him this out of loyalty, because she had none, but out of the same instinct that makes a drowning person clutch at another, and Alaric listened to his beautiful, decorative bride explain how thoroughly she had helped ruin him, and something in the king went very quiet and very old. He understood, at last, that he was going to lose his crown. And in the understanding came, unbidden, the memory of a woman who had never lied to him, who had held his headaches in her small, competent hands, who had spoken sense in his counsel when everyone else spoke flattery, who had loved him, He saw now with the terrible clarity of ruin, in the one way no one had ever loved him before or since, which was without wanting anything from him but him. He had called her a hedge witch, cluttering the dais. He had crushed her last kindness under his boot without looking down, and she had walked out of his kitchen yard and vanished so completely that in 2 years not one report had reached him of where she had gone, and he had told himself she had died in a ditch or crawled off to some border pack to be a servant, because the alternative, that she had simply built a life beyond his reach, had been unthinkable to a man who believed he was the sun around which lesser lives orbited. Now the unthinkable sat on the edge of his awareness like a splinter. Now, in the ruin of everything he had traded her for, Alaric Duskbane found himself thinking, in the small hours, of Wren Thornvale, and wondering for the first time in his life whether he had been the fool. The Council of Ironmoon, what was left of it, told the king there was only one road left that did not end in his abdication. He must go north. He must go, himself, to this warden of Ashenmoor, this rebel who held the river, and he must bargain for the water, because water bought the harvest, and the harvest bought the loyalty of the hungry, and the loyalty of the hungry bought the strength to face Magnus Coldwin when the old wolf finally called his debt. It galled him beyond words to go as a supplicant to a jumped-up mountain lord he had never heard of, but a drowning king will clutch at any rope. And so, in the 3rd autumn of the drought, Alaric Duskbane put aside his crown for a plain travelling cloak and rode north with a small escort along the same road down which his army had fled, to beg for water from a stranger. He did not know the stranger's name. His men had reported it as Warden Wren of the Silver Line. But Wren is a common enough name in the border country, and it had never once crossed the mind of the King of Ironmoon that the woman who now held his kingdom's throat was the same woman whose last gift to him he had ground beneath his heel. He rode north thinking he was going to meet an obstacle. He was going to meet a reckoning. And in the north, Wren received the message that the King of Ironmoon himself was coming to her gate to bargain for the river, and she sat for a long time with the letter in her hands, in the warm, bright hall of the holding she had built out of nothing, with Soren Ravenscar across the table, watching her face with the quiet attention of a man who had learned to read her weather. "You could refuse to see him," Soren said. "Send a steward. Let him bargain with a clerk. That's the deeper insult, and it costs you nothing." Wren looked at the fire for a while. She thought about the corridor and the tincture and the words "a convenient set of ears." She thought about the 6-year-old on the road out of a burning Ashenmoor, and the girl in the tower with the door that locked from the outside, and the silver wolf running north through the wet dawn. "No," she said at last. "I'll see him myself. Not to gloat. I don't want to scream at him or Soren. I did all my screaming on the inside years ago." She set the letter down. "I want him to look at me. I want him to sit across from what he threw away and understand it, all of it, with his own eyes, and know that I don't need one thing from him. That's not revenge. That's just the truth finally standing up in the room." Soren was quiet a moment, and then he reached across the table and, very gently, touched the back of her hand. Not to hold it, just to let her know he was there. "Then let's set the room," he said. The King of Ironmoon arrived at the gates of Ashenmoor on a grey afternoon with the first snow of the year sifting down out of a low sky, and the holding that received him was not the desperate rebel camp he had half expected. It was a thriving town of good stone and warm light, of full storehouses and busy furnaces, of well-fed people who watched him ride through their streets with a calm, level regard that unsettled him more than hostility would have, because there was no fear in it. These were people who had everything they needed and answered to someone who had given it to them, and they looked at the ragged, hungry escort of the once mighty King of Ironmoon with something that was almost, but not quite, pity. Alaric was brought to the great hall of the warden, and it was a hall built for work and welcome rather than for awe. Long tables and a great hearth, and, at the far end, a single chair on a low dais, its back turned to the door, facing the fire, as though the warden had been sitting in contemplation and had not troubled to rise for the arrival of a king. That, at least, felt like the insult he had expected, and Alaric seized on it gratefully, because insult was familiar ground. "I have ridden 4 days to treat with the warden of this place," he said to the hall, letting the old command come into his voice, the voice that had cowed councils and courts. "I am Alaric Duskbane, King of Ironmoon, and I haven't come so far to speak to the back of a chair." For a long moment nothing happened, and the fire cracked, and the snow ticked against the high windows, and then the chair turned. It turned slowly, and the woman in it let the King of Ironmoon see her by degrees. First the silver-embroidered hem of a warden's robe, then the strong soot-scarred hands folded in her lap, then the crescent and wolf seal on a chain at her throat, and last of all her face, lifted to the light, calm and unhurried, and utterly without fear. And Alaric Duskbane, King of Ironmoon, looked into the face of the hedge witch he had thrown away, and every drop of blood in his body seemed to stop moving at once. "Ren," he said. It came out of him without permission, cracked down the middle. She let the silence hold him. She looked at him the way you look at weather, without heat, and she said, at last, in a voice as level as the winter horizon, "Warden Wren of Ashenmoor, you may sit if your legs are tired from the road." He did not sit. He could not seem to make his body do anything. He stood in the middle of the hall he had come to conquer, and stared at the woman he had annulled, and the whole architecture of his understanding came down around him in silence. "You're alive," he said stupidly. "You're the warden. You're the one holding the river. All this time, it was you." "It was always me," Wren said. "That was the part you never learned, Alaric. It was always me. The council you ruled, the wounds you survived, the strength you thought was yours. So much of it was me, quietly, in the background, being the convenient set of ears, being the useful thing, being grateful for the cage. You just never had to notice, because I never made you." She rose then, not quickly, and came down off the low dais. And she was not a large woman, and she carried no weapon, and yet the king took an involuntary step back, because there is a force that has nothing to do with size, the force of a person who has stopped needing anything from you, and it is the one power against which pride has no defense. "I know why you've come," she said. "You've come for the water. Your river is dying because I am holding it, and your kingdom dies with it, and Magnus Coldwin is waiting to pick your bones. I know all of it. I've known for 2 years." Alaric's face worked. Some old reflex reached for command, and found nothing there to command with. "Then you know I am prepared to pay," he said. "Name your price. Silver, land, a title, a seat at the council. Whatever you have nothing I want," Wren said. And she said it gently, which was the cruelest way she could have said it, because it was simply true. "That's the thing you can't seem to hold in your mind. So let me say it slowly. There is no title you can grant me that outranks the one I was born to, and you spent 3 years teaching me to hide. There is no coin you can offer me that competes with the silver coming out of my own mines. There is no seat at your council worth anything to a woman who holds the water your council drinks. You came here to buy me the way you bought Vesper, the way Coldwind bought you, the way everyone in your whole gilded world buys everyone else, and you have finally met the one person in the 7 packs who is not for sale. And the King of Iron Moon, who had never in his life been refused anything he truly wanted, stood in the warm, bright hall of the woman he had discarded, and had no answer, because there was no answer, because, for the first time, he was in a room where his crown meant nothing at all. "That doesn't work on me anymore," she said, when he tried, as men like him always try at the last, to make it personal, to reach past the warden for the wife, to summon up some ghost of the 3 years and lay it between them like a claim. He said her name again, softer, and he spoke of what they had been, of nights and confidences, and the shape of a shared life. And he said, with the desperate honesty of a man watching his whole world sink, that he had been a fool, that he saw it now, that he had thrown away the only true thing he had ever held. And it was not even a lie. That was the strange, sad heart of it. He meant every word. The remorse in his face was genuine, too late and self-serving, and genuine all at once. And a lesser woman, a younger woman, the woman who had set the tincture down in the corridor, might have felt the old wound open at the sound of it, and mistaken his grief for a door reopening. But Wren had spent 3 years healing in the cold air of her own freedom, and she looked at his remorse the way a physician looks at a wound that has finally, correctly, closed. "I believe you," she said. "That's the part you won't expect. I believe that you're sorry. I believe you understand now, standing here with everything falling down, exactly what I was worth. But do you know what I finally understood, Alaric, up here in the cold, with my hands in the silt of my own mines? I understood that a man who only knows what you are worth after he's lost, you never actually knew your worth at all. He knew the shape of the hole you left. That's not love. That's an inventory. You're not grieving me. You're grieving the collapse of everything you built on top of me, without ever asking whether I minded holding it up." She walked to the great hearth and looked into the fire for a moment, and when she turned back, her face had changed, gone from the woman who had been wronged to the warden who governed, and the shift was so complete that Alaric felt the last of his hope go cold. "But I am not a cruel woman," she said, "whatever you made of me. And I am not going to let the farmers and the smiths and the children of the lower dominion starve in the dark to punish a man for a thing he did to me. That would make me what you were. So here is my offer, and it is the only one I will make, and it is not a negotiation." She returned to the dais, and she sat, and from the table beside the chair she took a document, a heavy folded charter sealed in silver wax, and she held it out across the space between them so that he had to come to her and take it from her hand, which he did, and she let him feel the weight of that, the small, unbearable choreography of the powerful coming to the discarded to receive their fate on paper. The water of the Vael will flow south again, the moment this is signed and sealed by every pack of the council, and it will flow forever after, she said, at a fair price, in silver, paid to Ashenmore, which is a sovereign holding of the 7, and always was. That is the mercy. Here is the price of the mercy, and here is where your Coldwind problem dies. The charter you hold in your hands acknowledges, in the words of the council of 3 generations ago, that no one in your line ever bothered to read, that the Crown of Ironmoon owes Ashenmoor 40 years of unpaid tribute and water right, an accounting so large that the whole treasury of Ironmoon could not settle it in a decade. That debt is real. It is older, and it is larger, and it is more lawful than any note Magnus Coldwin holds against you, and by the ancient precedents of the Council, an elder debt is paid first. Do you understand what I am giving you? I am handing you a debt so vast and so legitimate that it eats Coldwin's whole claim alive. When Magnus comes to call his loans and take your crown, you will show him this, and he will find that the throne he means to seize is already promised, lawfully and firstly, to the north, and there is not one thing his silver can do about it, because I am not selling. He cannot buy what will not sell. Alaric stared at the charter in his hands, and Wren watched the understanding move across his face in slow tectonic stages, the way she had once watched dawn move across the northern reaches. "You're forgiving the debt," he said slowly. "You have to be. You'll acknowledge it exists to break Coldwin, and then you'll forgive it, or you own my crown outright, and I am the pauper, and you are the queen of everything." "No," Wren said, and she smiled for the first time since he had entered the hall, and it was not a warm smile, and it was not a cruel one. It was the smile of a woman laying down the final card in a game she began playing the night she set a bottle on the cold stone floor. "I am not forgiving the debt. And I am not seizing your crown, because I do not want your crown any more than I want your coin. I am doing the one thing you and Coldwin and every powerful man I have ever known would never think to do. Because it never occurred to any of you that power could be held without being hoarded. I am holding the debt, openly, forever. Ironmoon will owe Ashenmoor, lawfully and firstly, for as long as the Vale runs, and every year you will pay a fair portion in silver and in honor, and every year the debt will still be there, larger than anything Coldwin holds, standing between your throne and every wolf who ever thinks to take it. I am not your queen, Alaric. I am your foundation. You built your whole life standing on me and called me a hedge witch cluttering the dais. Now you'll spend the rest of it standing on me, knowing exactly whose ground you're on, and paying every year for the privilege. That is the checkmate. You built the gallows. I bought the lumber, and I have decided, out of a mercy you did nothing to earn, to build you a floor with it instead of a scaffold. Magnus Coldwin came south to call his debt 3 weeks later, riding into the citadel of Ironmoon at the head of a column of his own household warriors, with the confidence of a man arriving to collect a crown, and he found the King of Ironmoon waiting for him, not as a debtor, but as a sovereign, with the water of the Vale already flowing south again, and the harvest already being pulled green and grateful from the reviving fields, and with a charter of silver wax laid on the council table that turned the old wolf's whole patient scheme to ash in a single afternoon. Magnus had built his campaign on the certainty that his loans were the largest and most lawful claim against the crown, and he was a careful man, and he had checked his ground 100 times, and it had never occurred to him, any more than it had occurred to Alaric, to ask what lay beneath the ground itself. When the elder claim of Ashenmoor was read aloud in the council, ancient and enormous and unimpeachable, and when it was made plain that the northern debt took lawful precedence over every note he held, and that the Warden of Ashenmoor had no intention of selling that precedence to him at any price, Magnus Coldwin understood that he had been outmanoeuvred, not by the king he had meant to devour, but by someone neither he nor the king had thought to count, a woman he had helped to discard, whose ruin he had personally financed, by paying for the wedding that replaced her. It is one of the quiet symmetries of this story that Magnus's own silver, the loans he had made to buy the throne, had funded the drought levies that drove the border packs into the arms of the north, and that his own daughter's cruelty had scattered the servants and healers who might have warned the king before the trap closed. He had built his own defeat, brick by patient brick, and never seen it, because he had been too certain of his cunning to imagine that the discarded could rise. He did the only thing left to a man of his kind. He withdrew. He called what debts he could that did not depend on the crown, and he retreated to his silver holdings in the east, a diminished and diminishing power, and within a few years the house of Coldwyn, which had reached out to swallow a kingdom, was smaller than it had been in a century, because a wolf that overreaches and misses does not simply return to where it was. It returns weaker, having shown its throat. As for Vesper, the replacement, the beautiful weapon her father had forged and aimed, and, in the end, abandoned, her humbling was quieter and more complete than any public disgrace. When it became known throughout the Dominion that the drought had been broken and the crown saved not by Coldwyn silver, but by the Warden of the North, and when the whispers began, as whispers do, to carry the whole story of the spy in the tower and the wife who was thrown away, and the silver wolf who came back holding the river, Vesper Coldwyn found that the dais she had craved had become a pillory. She had been given power without purpose, and she had spent it on cruelty, and now the power was gone, and only the cruelty remained on the ledger, remembered by every servant she had dismissed and every petitioner she had mocked. Alaric, who no longer had any use for a wife who had helped ruin him, and whose father had become a spent force, set the annulment in motion at last, the annulment he had once so casually ordered for another woman, and Vesper Coldwyn left the citadel of Ironmoon in a plain carriage on a grey morning, with none of the jewels and none of the title and none of the power she had come for, and no one came to see her go, and she rode east into the diminishing shadow of her father's house to become what such women become when the men who made them into weapons finally set them down, a sharp and bitter thing kept in a drawer, remembered by no one with fondness, and by everyone with a small, cold satisfaction. And it must be said, because this story is honest about its symmetries, that somewhere on that eastern road, Vesper Coldwyn passed within a few miles of the place where Calavain had come to live, and the two women never met. But they were the same kind of casualty, the weapons of powerful men, discarded when their edges dulled, and the difference between them, the only difference that mattered, was that one of them had known, at the very end, that she had loved the woman she betrayed, and the other had never loved anyone at all. There is one more account to settle, because a story about betrayal that does not reckon with the betrayer at close range is only half told, and the person who had done Wren the deepest wound was never the king. It was Calla. It is a strange law of the heart that the arrogance of a man like Alaric can be survived, even shrugged off, because you never truly gave him the tender part of yourself, only the useful part. But the betrayal of a friend, the person to whom you gave the soft, unguarded center of your life, that is the wound that does not close on its own. In the second winter of her freedom, before the drought and the reckoning, when Ashenmore was still finding its feet, a rider had come to Wren's gate, half frozen and alone, a woman in travelling clothes, who would not give her name to the sentries, but who held up, as her only credential, a length of blue thread braided into her own dark hair. They brought word of her to Wren, and the description of the thread went through the warden like a blade, because she knew what it meant. She had taught the braid herself, and she stood at the window of her hall for a long time, looking down at the small, distant figure waiting in the snow, and every part of her that had been wounded said turn her away. And one small part, the part that had once been a lonely girl who wanted a sister, said hear her. Wren had learned by then to distrust the loud voices in herself and listen to the quiet ones, and so she had Calla Vain brought into the hall, and the two women who had been closer than blood and then farther than enemies looked at each other across the warm, bright room, and neither of them spoke for a long time. Calla had come, she said at last, not to be forgiven, because she knew there was no forgiveness large enough for what she had done, and not to ask for shelter, because she had no right to shelter under a roof she had helped try to destroy. She had come because she could not live with the not saying of it any longer. She had been sent to Wren 3 years before as a task, an asset, a door to be opened, and she had done her work well and coldly and told herself the whole time that the friendship was a costume. And then one day, and she could not even name which day, the costume had become her skin, and she had gone on reporting to the king out of fear and habit and the terror of what Coldwin would do to her family if she stopped, all the while loving the woman she was betraying more than she had ever loved anything, and hating herself with a completeness that had eventually driven her out of the citadel and out of the whole rotten South to stand freezing at the gate of the one person in the world who had every right to kill her. "I don't want anything from you," Calla said, and it was the same phrase the king would use a year later, and it landed so differently because when Calla said it, it was true. "I just needed you to hear it from my own mouth, that it was real, the friendship was real. I know that ruins it. I know that a lie you meant is worse than a lie you didn't. But I couldn't let you spend your whole life believing that not one moment of it was true, because that was the only thing I did in 3 years that I'm not ashamed of, loving you, and I was too much of a coward to let it stop me doing the rest." And Wren, the warden, the silver wolf, the woman who had broken 2 of the most powerful men in the 7 packs and would break a 3rd, stood in her own hall and wept for the first time since the night in the tower, because grief that has been frozen for 2 years does not thaw quietly. She did not forgive Calla that day. She did not embrace her or invite her to stay. She was not a saint, and this is not a story about the erasure of consequence. She told Calla Vain that she could not have her in Ashenmoor, that the wound was too deep and the trust too shattered ever to be what it was, and that she would carry the knowledge of the betrayal for the rest of her life. But she also told her, quietly, at the door, as the snow came down, that she believed her, that she believed the love had been real, even though everything around it had been a lie. And she arranged, without fanfare, for Calla to be given a place in a small border pack far to the west, an honest, hard life among people who would never know what she had been, a chance, not at redemption, because redemption is not in anyone's gift to grant another, but at a life. It was not mercy for Calla's sake. Wren was honest with herself about that. It was mercy for her own, because she had watched cruelty curdle a beautiful woman into Vesper and a clever man into Magnus, and she had decided, up in the cold, clean air of the north, that whatever else she became, she would not let what was done to her become the thing she did to others. She would hold the debts. She would not become them. That was the whole of what she had learned, and it was everything. And so the years turned, as years do, and the north that had been a rumor became a certainty, and the certainty became simply the way the world was. The veil ran full and silver through the whole of the Dominion, and every spring the barges came up the river to Ashenmoor, laden with the tribute of a crown that would owe the silver line for as long as water ran downhill, and Wren of Ashenmoor received them not with triumph, but with the plain, steady attention of a woman tending a thing she had built with her own hands. She married Soren Ravenscar in the deep of a northern winter, in the warm, bright hall where she had once turned a chair to face a fallen king, and she let him braid moon lilies into her hair. And this time the hands that braided them wanted nothing from her but her, and she had learned, at last, to believe it. She never wore a crown. She was offered one more than once by Pax, who wished to make her queen of the whole reunited North, and she refused it every time, because she had watched what crowns did to the people who craved them, and she had decided long ago that she would rather be a foundation than a throne. And here is the thing worth carrying with you, out of the snow and the silver and the long, slow patience of a woman who was thrown away and did not break. They told her she was nothing. They called her a convenient set of ears, a hedge witch cluttering the dais, a girl with no house, and no coin, and no pack, and every one of them built their whole world on top of her, and never once looked down to see whose ground they were standing on. So if you are standing in a room right now where someone has decided your worth for you, remember Wren Thornvale, and remember this: the people who dismiss you are only telling you where they have stopped looking. What you do next is entirely, wholly, indisputably yours.